The gap between the haves and the have-nots is forever widening in South Africa. This is according to a number of researchers, and notably the Gini Coefficient Index. This affects a number of people and households who experience food inadequacy and hunger. How does food insecurity affect households? Well, to discuss this, we're now joined by Director of the Southern African Policy and Development Nexus, Professor Ndwanga Noyo. Professor, good morning and thank you very much for your time. Firstly, can you define food insecurity just for the benefit of those who might not fully appreciate what it is?
Well, good morning and good morning to your viewers, and thank you for having me. At the starting point, I think when we talk about food insecurity, it's all about access, the inability to access productive facets of the society in order to produce food for yourself. So access begins to be the main issue for me when it comes to food insecurity. Where do people have the basis to produce food for themselves? They do not have those baselines, so to speak. So we need to begin from the issue of access and then begin to understand why people do not have food and are able to feed themselves or unable to feed themselves.
We've seen many scholars in their research attempt to link hunger, inequality and poverty. They mostly argue that these are interlinked, and if we are to resolve these issues individually, we need to look at their connection. Can you perhaps give us an in-depth understanding of this link between the three?
Very important point, madam. When we look at the three evils, or the evils in society, we need to understand that they reinforce themselves. So poverty and inequality are not the same. Poverty and inequality, more often than not, reinforce each other. So the issue of access, as I was pointing out, does point to the fact that the majority of the citizens do not have access to productive activities. And why is it that many of the citizens do not have access to productive activities? We have to go back to the colonial historical tangents of this country, where the peasantry, or the peasant economy, so to speak, was destroyed in such a way that you find that the indigenous people were reduced to landless individuals and later on incorporated into the pernicious migrant labor system. So at the heart of insecurity, food insecurity, is also the lack of land, or landlessness, if we have to put it that way. That people are not able to produce for themselves because the majority of South Africans do not have access to land. And if we have to talk about poverty, then we need to bring into the center stage the whole equation of land. And land, for me, is the primary asset that people have to have access and then produce food for themselves.
And when we talk land, this is the competency of government here in their policies or implementing those policies, where we find land in the hands of ordinary people. So what can be done beyond just land to ensure that people don't go to bed hungry? Because this has been a focus of ours, and just going through these reports, it's honestly unbelievable that at this point, one would have thought we wouldn't have regressed so much, but we would have progressed.
Well, South Africa, I think we need to appreciate the fact that South Africa is not a poor country, right? And if South Africa is not a poor country, then why are the majority of people going to bed hungry? Well, first and foremost, if you have got to talk about land and land redistribution, the competences of the people also have to be taken into account. How many people can be able to produce for themselves? Does government have extensive agriculture, extension offices across the country that are able to teach people how to grow for themselves, how to make profits from agricultural products, but also be in that process of, or the mindset of being farmers and being able to use agriculture as a springboard against poverty and deprivation. So at the center of the land question is also the capabilities of citizens to produce for themselves. And they cannot do that without an extensive government intervention through, as I've pointed out, the agriculture extension offices. Agriculture then begins to be the springboard that should allow citizens to emancipate themselves from poverty and hunger. And to do that, there has to be a concerted effort to actually inculcate the mass of the people into that productive type of paradigm where they'll be able to produce food for themselves. But they cannot do it alone, because agriculture does have a very technical aspect to it. And that requires then, even at the subsistence level, to enable the citizens to produce for themselves, to harness their crops, to protect their crops from pests and other diseases, so that they are able then to make not only profits, but also feed themselves. So at the heart of agriculture is the capacitation of the citizens through these agriculture extension offices and other modalities.
It's an interesting aspect that you raise, because if we had the department here, they constantly would say that we have these programs where we go and encourage subsistence farming, be it even in the school environment, that if you're going to look at the feeding schemes in the schools, they tell us that we have been there. You go to the backyard, they are planting, they even know how to conserve water insofar as it applies to these particular foods that they would be farming in their backyard. So in most instances, they would say something contrary to what you're saying, that we have been there. But it sounds to me as though we have to start with the access to the land first, that maybe we're not seeing this greater energy to go out and teach insofar as agriculture is concerned, because the land is still not there.
Absolutely. And also we have to take into account that, you know, when you talk about land, you must also talk about arable land. Is it land that has got the capacity to produce food, or is it just land that is not fertile? So it's also designating pockets of land that is arable to poor people, to the excluded citizens in society, and then creating these agri-spaces that should allow them then to begin to harness that land and turn it into crop production and livestock production, so that they're able to sell their produce to particular markets. Also, I think when we talk about landlessness and the question of land, we should not treat land as, well, in a vacuum maybe, but also as an issue that is a standalone. So we need to look at backward and forward linkages. So if you get land, you've got to have inputs, right, to invest in that land that should give you your produce. But at the end of the day also, you must have markets. And at times, those who are on the lower end of the spectrum, when we talk about agriculture, do not have access to these big markets. This is where the state comes in. And we have heard about the state providing capacity for cooperatives, etc. But, we need to go beyond that. We need to go beyond that by skilling our citizens to be able to produce for themselves and take agriculture as a business. That's one side of the story. But the second side of the story, I would say, it resides in the mindset of the citizens. What am I saying? Agriculture must be part of the citizens' daily repertoire. So you can go to school and have a small productive production unit, but at the end of the day, what is the off-ramp to that, so to speak? Where do you go from there when you finish school with your understanding of agriculture? So there must be interventions that allow emerging farmers to be able to harness or access finance and also access land. At the same time, agriculture must be part and parcel of people's daily activities in such a way that, especially in the rural areas, that they are able to produce for themselves, but in a more efficient and more effective kind of way.
Professor, when we speak of food insecurity, it's not a problem that is unique even to just South Africa. It's a problem across the board. And we even listened just now with the UN General Assembly just concluding its session. We heard speaker after speaker acknowledging that the Sustainable Development Goals related to poverty, hunger are not on track, and they might not be achieved by 2030. So broadly speaking, beyond just a situation where we speak of South Africa, how can they change this?
Globally, we understand that when it comes to markets and export of Africa's produce, or the developing world's produce, we are always on the disadvantaged side. And we find that since we are all sort of mono-commodity producers, the exports are defined in terms of the pricing of the commodities by the West, by the international community, which is basically our former colonizers. And we do not have value for money when it comes to these exports. We do not have profits that could be replowed quite effectively into our nation's budgets in order to have a very expanded type of development. So there's a challenge. There's a challenge in terms of world markets not being in favor of the developing countries, especially Africa. But I want to get back to the point of South Africa itself being uniquely placed in this equation. South Africa is a unique country in such a way that it is a country that is able to produce dollar millionaires on a yearly basis, right? On the African continent. So we have individuals in a country, not where you can count small numbers, but quite a substantial. And research has shown that South Africa is producing dollar millionaires on a yearly basis.
Which speaks to the inequality.
Absolutely.
That on one end you have very wealthy individuals, and then on another, very poor individuals.
Very poor individuals. So what needs to be done? We have to talk about redistribution of resources. Equitable redistribution of resources is a very important point that needs to be taken into account by various policymakers. Many of these societies that are right.
Professor, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you very much for your insights this morning. That was Director of the Southern African Policy and Development Nexus, Professor Ndwang Noyo, on the food security issue in South Africa.